Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I can't see how many people are here or how many people are coming in, but we've opened the room now, so thank you very much for joining. Before we begin, I just would like to let everyone know that this is being recorded. So hopefully people will be able to watch back later on if they like. And we're going to have different ways in which you can interact with the seminar throughout the 1 hour and a half that we'll be doing this. So I'm going to begin in a moment by giving an overview of the research. This is the land and connectivity research funded by the African Cities Research Consortium. And after that, we're going to go straight into a couple of panels where some of our city researchers are going to be talking about their work around key themes. So the first theme we're going to look at is around key actors and power dynamics and conflicts in the urban land sector. And we're going to hear from 3 speakers talking about Maiduguri, Bukavu, and Mogadishu. And then there'll be time for some discussion, after which we'll go into a second panel, which is looking at issues of land value and challenges of land value capture. Now, in the introductory part and in the opening panels, you'll be able to put some comments and questions in the chat, and in the discussion section after each panel, we'll try and bring some of those questions forward for discussion. And then there'll be a final slot at the end where people are welcome to take up the microphone and speak a little bit as we start to think about the challenges of urban land reform in African cities. So this work, just for those of you who may not be familiar with the African Cities Research Consortium, this is a large program of research that is being funded for 6 to 7 years, funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And these are some of the core partners in the consortium, although now there's a far larger range of people who've been brought in and involved in different ways in the research. You can see on the right there the conceptual framework for the consortium. I'm not going to speak about that in detail, but essentially the research within the African Cities Research Consortium focuses on the politics of cities, the political settlement, using a particular framework around that, the idea of the city as a system, and cities as being places of interlocking systems. And then we look at what are called domains within cities, which are particular issue areas where authority and expertise come together. And we have been looking at the domain of land and connectivity, where we're trying to understand essentially the intersection between challenges of urban land governance and issues of infrastructure connectivity. So what we set out to do in this land and connectivity domain of research was essentially 4 things. One is we wanted to better understand the different kinds of conflicts and competing claims around land tenure in cities. And I'll show you a map in a minute of the cities we're working in, but we're looking at 6 different kinds of cities across 5 African countries. And so we wanted to understand competing claims to land, historical claims, and how those come together in urban areas and how that's changing and what it means for urban land reform. Secondly, we wanted to understand better how land value is created and destroyed. So we wanted to understand what leads to often soaring increases in land value, and what it means for governments to try and recapture some of that value to then put back into public services and infrastructure. And some of the challenges in thinking about how land value can be captured, both theoretically and in practice, when you have often really erratic patterns of land valuation and rapid changes in land value. The third thing we wanted to do was understand a bit more the administrative, institutional management processes concerning urban land, including with respect to new technology and digital technology. So how are new systems, digital infrastructures, digitization agendas feeding into the way that land is managed, but also the way land is bought and sold and fought over and contested? So what are the dynamics of land administration that feed into the broader challenge of managing urban land and raising revenue from urban? And then finally, and in a way, the big question overarching all this work is that nexus between land and connectivity. How is it how infrastructures in relation to transport and mobility and digital connectivity are changing the way land is used, affecting how land is valued, who can access different pockets of land? And so how do we understand these relationships between land conflict and management and that question of changing connectivity? Because in many ways, it is connectivity that gives urban land its value. So this is what we wanted to unpack, and we did this in these 6 cities. So we were looking, actually 6 cities in 6 separate countries. So Accra, Ghana, Bukavu in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've been working in Harare, Zimbabwe, Kampala, Uganda, Maiduguri in northern Nigeria, and Mogadishu, Somalia. And we have individuals and teams working in each of these cities on this broad agenda. But we also allowed each city researcher or city team significant flexibility to explore the particular aspects of this domain that interest them and that they thought were particularly challenging or important in their city. So we have a diverse range of findings, many of which will be discussed today. So before we go into the specific cities, and you're going to hear from 5 of our 6 city teams, I want to say a little bit more about some of the overarching findings that we want to talk through. And the first one, as I mentioned, we've got a theme which is around land value and how it's created and how it's captured. And this we find to be very interesting because in African cities, as in cities the world over, raising money for the government from land and property is one of the most fundamental ways in which local governments can fund themselves to provide infrastructure and services. But in many cases, this is very underutilized, and there's actually very little revenue collected from urban land and property. So I think if we want to understand the potential for urban land to fuel development, to fuel more inclusive infrastructures, we need to understand how land gets that value and how that can legitimately be recaptured to put into infrastructure and services. And that's why ideas of land value capture have been interesting and important for framing our work. Land value capture being based on the idea that it is public infrastructure and public planning and regulation that really gives land in cities its value. So you can then take back some of that value for public good. But what we find is that doesn't always work in contexts where land values are affected by a whole range of other things, aside from public infrastructure and forms of public regulation. For example, we see that issues of security, often provided by private actors or informal actors, have a huge impact on land values. Similarly, we find that infrastructure that is provided privately rather than publicly often has a very significant effect on land values. Sometimes land values are also affected just by the asymmetries in information by different kinds of people. So we'll see similar plots of land with very different values, depending on what certain people know about that land, how information is or isn't shared about that land. And this is all changing in the context of digital technology. And then, of course, there are all kinds of dynamics around the money that's coming into land as a speculative asset, forms of money laundering in some cases, which mean that land values can suddenly be inflated for reasons which are very different from the conventional reasons one associates with urban land value. On top of all of that, of course, the fact that often land prices are not well understood or registered, and taxation systems are not necessarily effective. And sometimes valuation of land is undermined, whether by corruption or just by a lack of capacity. All of this means that it's very difficult to know what the values of land really are and to recapture it. So this creates a lot of challenges around value capture and taxation. At the same time, we also find that the things that you would expect to increase land values, such as roads, sometimes they do, but sometimes they have quite the opposite effect. If there are roads that, for example, cut off particular neighborhoods or create new environmental challenges, flooding, huge amounts of dust, or maybe create new security challenges for certain areas, they can actually undermine rather than strengthen land values. So all of this kind of raises problems. We can start to unpack some of this in some. The other thing that we find connected to this is that, of course, land value is being captured. And as we've seen, it's being created land value by all these different things. And it is being captured by many people, but very often not by the government. And we see different actors in our different cities who are capturing that value with different implications for urban policy and urban reform. So in many of our West African cases, or particularly in the cases we're looking at in Accra, we see a lot of value being captured by informal actors, people known as various kinds of land guards who will protect land on the part of investors or landowners, often violently. and charge significant fees for doing that. And this is something you also see more widely across the region, certainly in parts of Nigeria. Traditional authorities have a very significant role in land in many of the cities, often involved in planning and regulation, informally or sometimes more formally, and they also recoup a significant amount of land value. And we also see various kinds of brokers, the people who are the go-between between buyer and seller, which of course you have in land markets all over the world. But in situations where these are very unregulated, often acting in quite opaque ways, we often see them able to capture much more than, for example, the 10% that officially that they would take as a cut. So lots of the value of land is being dispersed around the city in significant ways that aren't always adequately researched and understood. Again, in cases like Mogadishu, we'll hear more about this today, there are a number of actors who are capturing value in the context of a significant property boom. And a lot of that doesn't get back to the government agencies. So we're seeing forms of distribution happening, we're seeing forms of value capture, but they're not the ones that go along with our understandings about public value capture and public reinvestment in infrastructure. A further related issue just to raise is the ways in which we're seeing urban growth in urban peripheries, in many of our cases, without connected infrastructure really being present. And this kind of goes against conventional theories of urban sprawl, which suggest if you build connected infrastructure, growth will happen in those areas, right? So property development, land buying, land value rise happens in response to new infrastructure. In fact, we see almost the opposite. This is a picture from Accra, done by our colleague Ransford, who can't be here today, that shows in those darker purple areas where the connected infrastructure is built. But all of those areas in the peripheries are also being heavily developed and seeing a huge increases in land value, even without much of that infrastructure. And so this means we're often seeing lots of value going into unconnected land. And it becomes quite difficult then for the state to go into those areas because the infrastructure and services tend to be privately provided. Those private people are capturing the value, and it creates all kinds of challenge for that, cycle of government taxation and government service provision that are associated with often more inclusive patterns of development. So when we start to think about these things together, we see a relationship that in some ways is cyclical, or certainly we see a lot of connections in the kind of the challenge around the land question in cities. So on the one hand, you have land values that are not conforming to maybe expected rules about what produces land value. And often we're seeing rapid changes in land value and rather untransparent dynamics around the land market. This, of course, means that governments and other agencies don't hold often valid information about land. It's very difficult for them to tax and register effectively when the information they have may not be reliable. And that provides opportunities, again, for non-state actors to capture that value, all of which kind of perpetuates the cycle where the city authorities have limited resources and can only provide limited infrastructure in the peripheries. So all of these things, in a sense, feed into one another. And this is the kind of the complex knot of urban land and connectivity that we need to unpack in different cities. And there are different ways to try and get into that system and make positive changes. And sometimes that depends on the nature of the politics in that given city. And that's partly how we intersect with the political settlements work within the consortium. So and this is my final slide on that, in our report, which is now available. And if anyone is interested, the full report, as well as a short summary, is available online. We look at the different kinds of politics in the land domain and how that feeds into the challenges of governance. So we distinguish primarily between three main kinds of politics, one of which we just call land politics, and the other territorial politics, and then institutional politics. And just to go into that a bit more, when we're talking about land politics, we're talking about how land is used symbolically, in election campaigns. It has a lot of emotive value, often in relation to histories for particular groups who've been excluded or included in different ways. It's also, of course, a potential source of redistribution, including in the context of colonial dispossession. And it's a source of serious economic accumulation, whereby people can buy power and influence. But all of that, which we call land politics, is distinct from some other forms of things going on, including a more territorial politics that's actually about how you control who gets to access different parts of the city in different spaces, whether that's through roadblocks or through infrastructure you have to pay to use, or through where roads have entry and exit points. There's a different kind of politics around territory that isn't simply just about land itself. And then finally, and perhaps feeding most directly into our sessions today, there's also an institutional politics about who gets to govern and control land, which systems and institutions manage to prevail over other ones. And that includes struggles between one government agency and another, but also between formal and informal actors. Sometimes the informal actors having a lot more authority and legitimacy over the urban land system than the government does. And it's very difficult to address some of the broader challenges around land regulation and reducing land conflict when you have such an unsettled situation in terms of the institutions. So in our session today, particularly the first session, we're going to hear more in 3 cities about that institutional contestation and about those power dynamics within the land domain. So with that, I will hand over to Liza Chirolia, who is going to be chairing this next session.
Thanks, Tom. Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yes. So yeah, our first panel is focusing on the key actors, power dynamics, and points of conflict. And we have 3 cities that are on this panel, as Tom said earlier, Maiduguri, Bukavu, and Mogadishu. We didn't actually intentionally select cities that are often classified as conflict cities, but I think these are cities that are really emblematic of some really interesting, unique and kind of challenging conflicts, issues around land on the continent. I'd just like to remind people there's over 100 people on the call. It would be great if people want to introduce themselves in the chat, and there will be some time after for some questions. So please put those questions into the chat. We'll consolidate them and the panelists can respond during that last 10 minutes of this session. I will move us swiftly along. Tom already has our slides up and running. So we're going to be starting with Abubakar and Maiduguri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liza and Tom, for the introductions. Like she said, my name is Abubakar Mungno. I live and work in Maiduguri from the University of Maiduguri. I led the land and connectivity domain research in Maiduguri. Can we move to the next slide? Great. So key findings of our research. Before I go into the findings, I just wanted to inform you that Maiduguri is a city in northeast Nigeria that is emerging out of a 15-year conflict of Boko Haram. The conflict has come and it has really redistributed population. A lot of people at the peak of the crisis found Maiduguri safe to settle. And so this has lots of implications to what we're going to discuss today. From the outset, it's important to understand also that Nigeria operates a 3-tier system of government. We have the federal at the top, the state, and the local governments. But in terms of land, while all these 3 tiers are involved in urban land management and control, there is also another important group of people that we call the traditional rulers. The traditional institution is a very old institution in Nigeria, and in many cities they play, and even rural areas, they play significant roles in administering land, in controlling and managing land. But who actually gets what in terms of administering land has been an important issue of contestation within Maiduguri. Now, there is also the very clear existence of the Land Use Act of 1978, which was revised and updated in 2004, which is very, very clear that the governor of every state in Nigeria, we have 36 states in Nigeria, are actually empowered to administer over land. Now, this is where the problem is. So in many of the cities, we have local governments. Some have 2, 3, up to 4 or 5 local governments. In the case of Maiduguri, now within these constituent, elements that we call the local government systems, parts of them are rural, and most parts are, of course, urban. And so the Land Use Act clearly empowered the governors, or in this case, the governor of Borno State, to administer land. And that only meant that the state went into what they call the 2000 amendment, 2000 law passed by the State House of Assembly to delimit land which is within the framework of 25 kilometer radius. So all that portion, including whether it is rural or urban, is considered as urban, and only the governor has, rights of claim and actually administration. Now, that simply means that within this 25 kilometer radius, we have the federal, we have the state, we have the local government, and as well the traditional institution, all trying to administer land, even though the Land Use Act recognized the governor. But previous governors have not been actually asserting this control and management of land until 2019. When the present governor came, he asserted his, control of this land, which was actually given to him, by the Land Use Act, and that's where the problem started. So at the moment, there is no much problem with the federal government. Whatever it has controlled as piece of land is already divesting, and so local governments have been made powerless, because within the urban areas, it's only the governor that can issue grants and all that. And now the governor has come to set up what we know as the Borno Geographic Information Service. Now, what is the greatest challenge of urban land administration in Maiduguri? The greatest challenge now is that of how to deal with traditional rulers or the traditional institution, who are respected by community members, who have significant, hold of land, and therefore there is tension between the traditional institution as a power block and the state government. Can we move to the next slide? Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Now, what are the implications of all this on what has been the reform? The reform obviously is the creation of Borno Geographic Information Service, which is BOGIS. It has come. It has been seen as a game changer because there are no issues of trespasses in land. Tenure is more secure now, and things are going. But there is problem with the traditional institution. There is problem with the local governments. The local governments who were previously in control of some of the portions of land have now been kicked out of control of the urban land. Now, but amidst all this, even though the coming of BOGIS has really become a game changer, it has improved situation, but there is still political patronage in terms of land allocation. And this is another key challenge that the reform is yet to address. Now, it's only serving, for most parts, the interest of politicians and some well-to-do individuals of the society. The other aspect is that the reform, which is the establishment of BOGIS, seems to also cost very high on the urban poor. You need to pay some taxes to get your papers, well into the system. And to do that, you have to pay for the service, to secure your land and all that. And for that to happen, therefore, the urban people need to pay, and that has become a key issue. Many of these poor people are, of course, internally displaced, like I initially said, arising from the Boko Haram, conflict. So in the midst of all this, what do we recommend? Number one, we recommend that the system that is called systematic land titling, where existing land parcels are recognized by BOGIS, which is an ongoing project, which our research is now coming to explore more deeply through an action research, is something that needs to be very, very strengthened. And if possible, some of the fees that are charged could be, streamlined, could be reduced so as to bring on board so many poor people into the system. So number one recommendation is that we continue with the systematic land titling, meaning if portions of land have been issued by the traditional institution, by the local government, the state government can go and update its records and issue new titles to such, holders. The other issue that we are recommending is the issue of urban land reform that needs to be staggered. The government is now trying to, force its way to unbundle this issue of registering all persons of land. And this is creating a lot of concern, especially among the poor segments of the society. And the fundamental fear is that of dispossession of land. And so it needs to be a little bit slowed, and so that all people are taken on board. And then lastly, we recommend that the high demand, for land as the city emerges out of conflict needs to be addressed. Maiduguri is over 1 million people, and the city is now emerging out of conflict. A lot of people from the rural communities outside of the city have come to seek refuge here. So there is very high demand for land, which the ordinary people do not easily get. And so we need, systems where, yes, even with this reform, that we take people on board, especially the poor segments of the society, to make sure that at least a sizable number of them get, what they really need to put, themselves in shelter. Thank you very much for listening, and I await your questions.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting. We're going to move swiftly along to Jean-Louis and Bukavu. Thank you so much.
I'm Jean-Louis Nzeve. I come from Bukavu, from the Catholic University of Bukavu. I am still PhD, and I am working in the Laboratory of Socioeconomics of Environment. Well, the English is my fourth language, so I apologize if sometimes I am not good in my expression. Bukavu is a city in the Eastern Congo. And in this region, we have a high demand of housing and high demand of land to build. This high demand comes from rural exodus, and rural exodus have a particularly problem during wars, because the Congo, we had two episodes of war from 1996 to 1997 was the first episode, but we have the second episode from 1998 to 2003. But war is continuing in other forms with action of non-state armed groups. But in the city, during the war, the rebel authorities take acts like government. And during this period, rebel authorities was first enabled to master the pressure of rural exodus, and they tolerate and sometimes they authorized anarchic constructions. And after the war, there was a dialogue, and in the end of the dialogue, the central government and the rebels signed a peace agreement. And in this peace agreement, they convinced that administrative acts of rebels during the war will be endorsed by the government. So it was a famous political settlement. And as I said, some of acts of rebels concerns land governance. And after the war, with this endorsement of administrative act of rebels, we observe a kind of assimilation and a coalition of political and business elites from former rebels and other political actors. So this coalition, these coalitions in Bukavu city are known throughout their arrangement on land governance. And these arrangements concerns land grabbing and conflict management, and especially capture and embezzlement of land value. So these arrangements affects the people, and people sometimes resist by many kinds of resistance. The first form is passive resistance, but the second form is to declare a justice procedure. And sometimes people manifest this resistance by demonstration, public demonstration, or some kind of violence. We can continue. So now we have many problems which is provoked by this arrangement on land governance. What's the first problem? The first problem is that land governance arrangements as factors of urban degradation, especially by violation of urban standards. The second problem is the security of public land in a context of failed states, because the Congo shows the sign of failed state, because the government is unable to protect sometimes the public goods, especially public lands. Another implication is formation of public and private coalition for, that's a recommendation now. The first recommendation is to form a public and private coalition for rehabilitation and sanitation of cities. The second recommendation is the challenge of a priori and a posteriori urban planning in countries with dynamic demography. And to end is the last recommendation is land taxes mobilization and development financing in poor countries. Thank you for your tolerance for my bad English. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really exceptional that we don't often bring together Francophone and Anglophone scholars, and especially not without translation. So thank you for really trying very hard, and for everyone for really thinking across these different and unique cities. So we're now going to turn to Mogadishu, the last in this panel, and Abdi Fattah is going to be leading this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And today I will be speaking about land conflicts in Mogadishu and the particular kind of impact on the state-society relationship. So to begin with, just to give you a bit of a context first, Somalia is undergoing a rapid urbanization. The rate is about 4.3, and this is a population of 15 million. So approximately you have about 50% of people living in urban areas now. And this urbanization is particularly gaining momentum at a time when Somalia is recovering from a prolonged conflict. For the past 34 years and even longer than that, there has been a civil war going on in the country, and there are signs of recovery heavily invested by both the international community and the Somalis themselves. So within this drive of state recovery and kind of re-establishing the state institutions, we see an emerging, high level of conflict, which is heavily intensified by not only the rapid urbanization, but also ambiguities in land ownership, in the sense that many documents have been lost in the meantime, and people have moved around, displaced people often settle in public land. So we see more recently in almost all cities in the country, high level of conflicts between the state trying to recover the land it used to own before the civil conflict, and the people who occupy or stay in that land. An example that I can give, which kind of exemplifies more recently how things are happening, is a land that has been occupied for 30 years by civilians. And this land is now targeted for eviction by the authorities. What I think is very common in Somalia is that there is a significant level of resistance against the state because people are, armed, and the state cannot do what it wants at the particular moment it wants. Other examples include like Hargeisa. You can count them in many other cities in Somalia, like Barave. These are kind of conflicts which are happening and are gaining momentum in a much bigger volume than the past. What complicates the matter, though, the eviction, is that land that was confiscated by the government in the past was sold at a very low price to individuals who are connected to the government. So there is an issue of trust as well within the land confiscation processes and problems that are going in Somalia. So what we are seeing is a state recovering and trying to recoup what it owned in the past, and then there are all sorts of complications. Can I go to the second slide? So the implications of this particular trend of conflicts between the state and the people is that the authorities claim, or reclaim of formerly public land buildings. The intention and the stated objective is that the state's capacity is going to be strengthened by the fact that it kind of recaptures what it used to have in the past. So that process of redefining the state's agenda along all lines, what used to be there, before, in conditions where the power dynamics are organized and the structures of the power is organized as well. There are people who have more power now who did not used to have that power. The state used to be in full control of the territories of the country, which is not the case now. The administration of the country is fragmented along, different portions. Some even stating that they are seceded away from the rest of the country. So it's these kind of policy objectives is operating in kind of all lines that used to be there. And there is a significant resistance. And one way in which maybe this kind of a resistance is very different from most of the African cities who are going through similar problems is that it is very lethal due to the widespread availability of small arms in the country. You can basically go and buy some weapons, especially small arms, in Mogadishu at will. Definitely, you will need to register with the government. But there is a free market where you can buy, land. Weapons. So this violence and counter-violence exacerbates the already volatile state-society relations. And that, again, undermines the very objective of the state trying to recoup, the state trying to, build its capacity for control, political control, territorial control, and urban speciality control. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the rapid urban growth and the state's inability to manage this negative impact, such as land conflict, is catalyzing kind of collective action from the people, mostly very violent. And the question then here is, what does this mean for the cities in Somalia? There are quite a significant number of them which are recovering from conflict. And what is happening in Mogadishu and other cities in the country, especially in terms of, state society clashes, will have significant bearing on how these, is unfolding. There are a number of, I will end with a number of recommendations that I think will be very crucial. One of which there are moral questions on how this is going to be done, and I think that needs to be addressed before these kind of exercises are taking place. Again, the objectives and the outcome need to be realigned. Otherwise, this will be counterproductive, especially if things like fit for purpose kind of policies could be adopted in regards to especially accommodating a process of shifting away from the past, how the state used to do things in the past, more into innovative ways, which can allow the state to recover more quickly in less violent ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was just unmuting myself, Abdi. Thank you so much to all three speakers. These are incredibly rich cases. And obviously behind each of these cases, there is considerably more research that has been done, both academic research done by each of these scholars and also in the actual reports, both city reports and the consolidated reports that have been published. So we're going to open up for a few minutes of questions. I see there's one or two questions in the chat, Tom, if you want to bring these forward, but if others want to add, we can definitely also take one or two more. We can position these questions directly to the colleagues that they are for.
Yeah, thanks, Liza, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to our speakers. We've had a few comments in the chat and questions, and I'll put out the second one. Nadeem, thank you very much for your question about land value capture more generally, which I think is something we will come back to in a slightly later discussion, if that's all right, focusing now a bit more on the three presentations that we've had. So there's a question here around an interesting question for the first two presenters. This is a question from, sorry, forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Siartha Koza, about placeness. So this is a question about how do we move in cases such as Maiduguri and Mogadishu beyond thinking of these places as post-war and post-conflict. And I think the question is also asking about, from a practitioner perspective, how do we move from a sense of a kind of anarchic construction, unregulated development in a post-conflict city into something that is more, that takes it out of that identity of just a simply post-conflict space into something else. So this, that's that might require a bit of thought. And of course, it connects to land. It also connects to a range of other issues. But it's true that we have had essentially three post-conflict cities presenting in this particular session. So it kind of skews our discussion in that direction. Does any of our speakers have any thoughts on this question of moving beyond the post-conflict phase, the post-conflict city, and what that means in terms of land, particularly? Other people, please do fire any questions in on the chat, or if you'd rather speak, you're welcome to.
Yes, can I begin, Tom?
Yes, please.
Okay, please. Thank you very much for that question. As for Maiduguri, what we're now seeing is government now taking a firmer control of how development is going to look like. So that's the positive aspect of technology. As we speak now, all parts of Maiduguri have been land, in Maiduguri have been digitized. And so government is now trying to direct development in the way it wants. And it's very difficult now for what used to happen before, these informal settlements to rise in the way they did. because of this law that is trying to, get a very, very firm control of land. Well, for now, that this is as far as this government is concerned. We don't know of what might come in the next few years when another governor comes. He might want to build on that, or he might relax the policy. But for now, what we see is that government is, the state governor is in control of what happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Abubakar. There's another question in the chat, but did anyone else want to respond to that one? If not, I can go ahead and quickly ask this one and see if we have any thoughts on this, which is about the role of the UN. So thank you, a question there from Francesco. What is the role of the UN and international organizations more generally in these cities, and particularly in land administration reform, and how that relates also to infrastructure investments in the city? Anyone has thoughts on that?
I think this is a great question for Abdi. Yeah. Why don't you jump in, Abdi?
Yeah, it's actually, Francesca, it's really a very interesting question. And the truth of the matter is, especially in Mogadishu, and I think the same goes for many other cities recovering from conflict, is that the UN is the government, basically. So you will realize all the development proposals are conducted by the UN, all the assessments regarding, urban issues are conducted by the UN. And it seems, though the way in which they do all of these programs is counterproductive in the sense that they don't enable the local institutions to perform their duties. Basically, everybody relies on the UN. And you will realize on the urban issues, they're working on, there are very few people who are trained for this objective. So it's basically the contracts are given to consultancies, which end up, do their job, produce a report. But if you cannot, turn that report into a reality on the ground, then it's a problem, because people who are there on the ground are not sufficiently trained for things like urban planning or translating the documents into policies. And such program would have been very useful if it had, a component which addresses, the whole chain, co-considers the whole chain from the production of the plan to, the implementation of the plan, where the locals are trained in urban, very needed development planning and implementation skills. So I think that's where the problem lies. The good thing is they help out in, pumping a lot of money into this, but they leave out the last part, which is about the implementation.
Thank you, Abdi. That's really interesting. And there's some great questions coming through in the chat, which I think we'll push into the next section. And this is also an opportunity for me to hand back over to our co-lead on this domain, Abdi Fattah, who is now going to be chairing this following session. Thank you so much for all of your questions, and to all the panelists for really fantastic inputs.
Thank you very much, Liza. So just, welcome to the second segment of today's webinar. In this segment, Sam, Surer, and Area will explore the factors driving land values in Accra, Mogadishu, and Kampala, as well as the, urban development implications and strategies for navigating these, kind of complex environments. So the first will go to Accra. Samuel.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel. I work for the SD Dombo University of Business Integrated Development Studies. I did this with a colleague, Farouk Brahma. He works with the NGO sector People's Dialogue in Ghana. Next slide, please. Yes, as the chair has indicated, we sought to find out the determinants of land values in Ghana and in Accra in particular. And then we had a conventional literature that talks about certain factors that determines land values. And based on that, government, both national and local government, could capture those values. So what we found out was that announcement of public projects we found out in the peri-urban areas that are still prone for urban growth. In the city of Accra, government had certain projects that it made pronouncements about their implementation. One of such projects was a planned city extension project that was sponsored by UN Habitat in certain parts of Accra. And when this project was being announced, developers, speculators move ahead to purchase lands in those areas, and that increased the values in those areas significantly. Government also had another project called the airports. They're planning of relocating the international airports to a certain suburb in Accra area. And they had done the planning and everything. And that alone also pushed up land values in that area. Plus other projects that the government planned, including the industrial enclave and the rest. Some of these project announcements were made. Others, some further works were done to plan the area. And whilst this one was going on, you had estate developers. That's an opportunity in this area. They moved to buy lands in that area, and land values shot up significantly. The other factor we found out was also that Accra has an interesting phenomenon. Had traditional authorities that are led by the chiefs, and also have families that own land and they sell this land to developers. And in areas where family own lands, it becomes a little difficult in disposing of the land to people who are buying. You would have one family having a number of members of that family, and each member would take a turn in selling a plot of land to a particular developer. And after it is sold, another family member comes from behind and says, no, you dealt with the wrong person. Then we're going to sell it to you. And then because you have already bought the land, you wouldn't want to lose it. So you go ahead and pay another money to this family member. And then the process goes on. And it's about one plot. In the end, you pay about 3-4 times. And this also pushed up the land values in those areas. And this was also a challenge that land values were rising in those areas. Another thing we found out was that land values did not actually increase, as we should say. There was some kind of stabilization, especially in government areas that government had compulsory acquired the land and then had leased it out for development. And then the second owners went into joint ownership with property developers. So when you come and they are putting the price in mind that whatever is given to you, we are going to develop it together. So in other words, the landowner has a stake in the development that is being done. And because of that, they'll quote the price in such a way that his share of the portion would not necessarily push up the price, but would give him a stake in that investment. So sort of land prices were not growing as they should, but more or less stabilized because of this principle of joint venture agreement. And then, as we said, Accra, certain parts of Accra are full of conflicts, especially in the family land areas where families control and lease out. And these areas, they employ various tactics, informal practices, using land gas to prevent or to protect the land. And if you have a land in this area, after you have bought and then you are coming to develop, you have to pay some other fees to this land gas to be able to develop. And even in some areas, the families, they have something they call digging fee, development fee, and the rest. You need to pay before you be able to get the land developed. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. So we found out that those who were benefiting from these land value increases were basically non-state actors like the land gas, the family land owners, and then in areas that are traditional authorities, they benefit from this land through the informal practices. For instance, if a land is sold for one parcel of land is sold to 2 different people, the landowners benefit from the price of this. And we also realize that government has not got any value capture instruments that is able to take care of all these informal practices. We have two levels of government. You have the national government, you have the local government. And then the local government basically would go through property rates. And then they have other instruments they call betterment charges, which is never implemented in Ghana. The national government would always go through the stamp duty. When you have registered your land, you have to pay stamp duty as a way of capturing the value in the land. So government is not able to do this. One, because in areas developers have purchased land, most of the time the tendency is to secure the land by developing it. So they are not interested in going to register it first. They must secure the land before they move on to develop, to register it. So in that, when they go to the registration stage, most of them would undercut the amount in which they bought the land, because they know that if you quote the right amount, you are going to pay a stamp duty of that equivalent. So what happens is that they would they undervalue the land, so that they'll be able to pay lower stamp duties. What government has been doing in this area is that at the stamp duty department, now they have to do a revaluation so that they'll be able to get the right values, but this is not always done. At the local government level, it becomes difficult. There's a law on the Local Governance Act that says that any gain on land, urban land transaction, the one who is gaining is supposed to pay a certain tax to local government authority. But local government authority do not keep land transaction records. So it becomes a difficult thing to track that, to be able to charge or tax people who are selling and buying land, to be able to capture this value. So we see that in terms of reform, there's a prospect of identifying and documenting both formal and informal processes. We recently had a land reform
Sam, I have to intervene. The time's over. You are, almost 1 minute. Yeah.
Thank you. So we need to streamline.
Please, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we need to streamline the land allocation process so that the traditional authorities are able to document this, so that we are able to get the right data to be able to undertake some form of land value sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sam. Our next speaker is Surer Mohammed on Mogadishu. Welcome, Surer. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much. My name is Surer Qasim Mohammed. I was the land and connectivity research lead for Mogadishu, and I'm currently the Harry Frank Guggenheim Research Fellow at Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. So as we were speaking about before, Mogadishu is a city that is obviously dealing with severe challenges, but what you may not know is that the city is urbanizing rapidly. At some estimates, some 4% annually, which is changing the face and the skyline of the city. Mogadishu's urbanization is driven by multiple factors: conflict and climate-driven displacement from other regions in the country, diasporic return and investment from far-flung areas like the UK, Sweden, but also the nearer diaspora, including Kenya and Uganda, but also a great deal of rural to urban migration, which is also encountered in other African cities. What's important for our purposes is that the combined impact of these transformations has been incredibly striking. As we've seen a building boom, which has renovated government buildings, offices, residential houses, and hotels, shops, other forms of consumer goods are now available. And importantly, the actors have shifted as well. Large telecommunications and financial services companies, such as Hormuz Telecom and their in-house real estate company called Bruj, IBS Bank, Salam Bank, have all pivoted to the provision of land and real estate services, including purchasing and selling, and have become outsized actors in the space. So we really do see that link between land and connectivity in the context of the show. In fact, just today, it's been announced that several outlying areas have been officially incorporated into Mogadishu, which accounts for and speaks to the level of urban sprawl that there is in the city. That being said, there is very little land value capture, which is something that I think we can speak about in another context. But as I've been alluding to, the values in Mogadishu, land values in Mogadishu are skyrocketing. And so one of the questions we were interested in answering in a kind of very brief, very introductory way is why? And one of the challenges that we faced is obviously that we have the absence of significant data. The municipal information by their own reports is somewhat unreliable on this factor. So what we did was we had, in addition to the work that we were doing on land and connectivity, we also did some focus groups with land brokers on the drivers of land value change within different urban districts, but also between them. Why land brokers, you might ask? This is something that has come up earlier in this seminar, but in Mogadishu in particular, land brokers manage the pricing and negotiation of sales, often accumulating critical information about the past, present, and futures of entire neighborhoods, while other actors such as notaries and attorneys register the value of these transactions with the Ministry of Finance. And in fact, some authors have even called these kind of different actors and their role in regulating the land management of Mogadishu a kind of co-regulation, where it's not just state actors who are responsible for the management of land. So I'm going to point to three main ideas that we got from these land brokers and their ideas about why land value change is happening in Mogadishu and why it's happening where it is. The first is the idea that urban insecurity, or the concept of where the elites can live, tells a lot about value and prospects for future values of land in a specific area. As one land broker explained, where security is, stable money is. Urban denizens in Mogadishu are constantly being confronted by a lot of mobility constraints. So they might face a checkpoint here, a difficulty accessing a road there. And all of these are mediated by questions of personal security in terms of, am I going to be personally secure? Is someone going to try to attempt to take what I have? But also like spectacular forms of security, such as, is there a likelihood that this area might be targeted by Al-Shabaab in an explosion? Areas that the elites can live are typically ones where there's more visible security architecture and the government is present in order to be able to manage mobility and access to those spaces. So these are actually areas where mobility is more constrained than others. This is something that we can talk about later. Another key factor is the question of urban inclusivity. One of the legacies of urban warfare in the context of Mogadishu specifically is the creation of spatialized identity enclaves, right? Questions around how basically clan-based militias were able to carve up the space of the city in their name. And then what happens now is that areas that are more heterogeneous tend to be more valuable because these are areas that more types of people can buy and sell. Finally, I don't know if I'm coming up to the end of my time, but yeah, finally, we've got the question of urban land and economies. And this is really important. One of the people said, land is our bank. Because land in the context of Mogadishu is one of the only stable economic investments that one can make, where land values are expected to rise steadily year over year. And so this transforms how elites and well-to-do urbanites interact with land, seeing it as a stable investment and using it as a speculative asset. I'm just going to quickly go over the points in the next slide, if that's okay. Thank you. The implications. So obviously, one of the major implications for rising land values across the board is going to be the question of what happens to people who are displaced and people who are in the urban poor as the city continues to gentrify and as people are moved further and further into the periphery with fewer access to basic services and fewer access to important urban amenities such as education and healthcare. Another is what Dr. Abdi Fattah was telling us about earlier, is that these issues around skyrocketing land values make struggles over land disputes and questions over land ownership far more fractious and make it more likely that these challenges are going to devolve into continued cyclical patterns of violence. And finally, we have this question of spatialized mobility constraints, which on one hand, for elites, seems to be a solution to their question of personal security, but continues to lock many people out of access to economic development and also access to basic services. So what does this mean about how the city is reconstructing and who it's reconstructing for? So there are a few possible recommendations for policymakers. Obviously, questions around urban insecurity is going to be at the forefront, but also important questions around urban planning measures and also knowledge about urban planning issues that Dr. Abdulfatah has mobilized or mentioned before.
Yeah, Surari,
yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you so much.
Please. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Surar. Our next speaker is Area. I hope I pronounce it correctly, on land brokerage and value capture in Kampala. Welcome.
That's okay, Abdi. Thank you so much. Ria Selwaja here from Makerere University and the lead for land and connectivity in Kampala. I think from our end, we looked at land brokerage and land value capture for particularly Kampala. And one of the things that we actually found out was that the brokers have become so powerful in the city, and they are they even have the power to challenge the state extensions of the state on the ground, including land valuers, including local government officials and the like. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But the thing is that, you know, the opening up of the space, particularly during because of liberalization of the economy, that the state has to get a little bit off certain aspects within its reach. For instance, land transactions have now sort of been privatized in a way. Previously, the state was at the center, that whoever bought land and sold it was literally, you know, monitored in a way. But now, under liberalization, if you have land, you can sell it or you can buy at any time, and the fee cannot be regulated by the state. Now, that's where the brokers have become much more of a force. They have various, and of course, when you talk about brokers, we're not talking about a homogeneous group. There are various categories of brokers. There are those that live within the elite part of town, you know, the uptown parts of the city, but there are those that, you know, they are like sort of foot soldiers. You know, they look for the customers from door to door within the communities. So those different categories have also their own spaces, but overall, brokers have become a key factor in terms of refashioning and reshaping land values in Kampala. And they capitalize on gaps in the information flow, what Tom just mentioned as information asymmetry. So at the end, they sort of know who is selling the land, they know who intends to buy the land. So in between, you have the landowner who has no idea or who has the money to buy the land, but you have this person who knows, the person who is selling, and the person who intends to buy, and stands in the middle. First negotiates with the owner and later negotiates with the buyer at different times and knows exactly how much the land is going to be paid for. And anything over and above what the seller is demanding for is taken up in addition to the percentage that would have been agreed on with the sale of the land, but also the buyer. So these brokers have become so powerful in Kampala City. They even have the capacity to block the land transfer. If you don't agree with them, then they will not show you who wants to buy the land and who has the money to buy. So this is the category of people that we are talking about. They also heavily influence land values, as indicated, connect the buyers and the sellers, but more importantly, they are capturing a certain space and exploiting the gap where even the state at the moment has no idea on how they should be regulated. They don't pay taxes, while the amount of money they are making within the city is sort of immense. So how do you capture that space and take it back? Within the domain, we had a section to do with taxation and how that can be captured by the state, but it's very difficult to deal with private individuals at that level. So if you look at land value, you know, within the larger connectivity aspect, we also realize that connectivity increases land value. If you're looking at Kampala Entebbe Expressway, for instance, or the Ginger Bridge, the new Ginger Bridge that connects Kampala and Ginger. But those particular infrastructure also have the capacity to devalue the land, if you like. And we had examples that are out of town, for instance, at Accra, Ropi Road, where people, indicated, and of course, those are those that live in Kampala, that their properties were sort of devalued in terms of reduction of land value in those particular areas because of the increase in the elevation of the road and therefore block access. And when you have that kind of blocked access, then it means that your land value, the value of your land is going to go down. If you want to move to the next slide. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about brokers that are so powerful, but categories of people that are capturing money that is also out of the reach of the state in terms of they cannot be taxed, while the government now is struggling in terms of taxation generally. But in the end, these particular people are getting a lot of money, but the government has not come out to find a way to tax them. So brokers don't pay taxes, which means it's a loss to the economy. They are also, if you're looking at reform in terms of bringing that into the mainstream economy, there are going to be frustrations and blocked fights between, some of these people that are buying land are politicians, state officials that are using land as engaging in land banking, if you wish. So in the end, such persons are not willing to allow reform to say, we need to know how much you're earning from this brokerage business, and therefore you should be able to pay this amount of tax to the government. So the government has to find a way to bring that into the mainstream taxations regime so that we're able to see some kind of even regulation within of these particular brokers. The second is state intervention. How do you intervene in an area in a period of liberalization? It's still something that is very difficult to disentangle. So challenges of streamlining land information is very important. And of course, within our domain, we actually came up with an idea of coming up with a particular way to streamline this access to information by both the sellers and the buyers, so that you sort of deal with the brokers in the middle. And when you do that, then you're able to sort of find a way up to navigate these particular categories of people. The reduced tax base is very critical. So this is
thank you, Arya. Could you wrap up, please?
The brokers pay some bit of tax. Yeah. So for me, one last take here is that we must also deal with what you call an under-implement, that when the government invests in the road and you get a lot of money out of it because of the improvement in infrastructure, the government should be able to capture that particular dimension of the increase that you did not work for. Thank you, Abdi.
Thank you very much indeed for the presentations, to all speakers, Sam, Sorer, and Area, and for the audience for their patience. Now we shift into discussion for about 10 minutes on reforming urban land processes and institutions. Liza, I understand.
No worries, Abdi.
You mentioned you have some consolidated questions, yeah?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I've compiled the questions from the chat. Yeah, I've compiled the questions for the chat, so I'll throw them to the different speakers. So there's an interesting question in the case for Area on brokers, and a few questions related to whether or not we can try to get brokers to be part of organized bodies and regulate them, as well as a question around the digitization, which I think is really useful. So if you can pick up on that question. A whole stream of questions for Sir, who I think the Mogadishu case, again, is absolutely fascinating, about whether or not land offers as safe havens, and also the sort of implications of destructed records, but also a few questions about the tension between memorializing the history and trying to reconstruct in new and different ways. So perhaps you can pick up that one. And then Sam, I think if you can pick up the question of collusion between state and non-state actors and whether or not that came through in the Accra case, as well as I think the question about, if you'd like to, about how poor actually do access land. I know we spoke a lot about the peri-urban peripheries in that case as well, and someone did ask that question. So if you guys can kind of we only have a few minutes for this, but I wanted to just allocate those questions. You can pick the ones that speak most to you or that you feel most inclined to respond to.
Thank you, Liza. Maybe I need to go fast. I think the issue of digitalization, Uganda has implemented has digitalized the land titles, this large, what they call land information system. But when we did interview the people at the Ministry of Land, they often said, as long as you have a human being at the back of this supercomputer, that is where the digitalization is done, then you're often going to have a problem. So for me, digitalization is a good way to sort of start. But again, brokers, within the transfer process itself, you have, even at the Uganda Revenue Authority, they will often rely on letters from the LC, the agreements, which are written by human beings, and now under valuation can come in. But also, they also try to sort of revalue, but revalue from the office rather than going to visit the property and see whether it's worth. But the other last bit is that we've seen a disconnect between government valuers and land brokers. In the areas where we did research, the brokers often indicated that the land values by the government valuers are far off from the realities on ground, meaning that these brokers have the crispy understanding of the everyday land value within a particular area. So that disconnect for me still needs to be bridged, even when you have this the digital land information system under the Ministry of Lands. Thank you.
Sure. Do you want to pop in after this? Are you prepared?
Sure. Quite a few amazing questions, and I think things that we could talk about for ages. The first question about land as a safe haven asset in light of debt cancellation and normalization of relations with Somalia's international financial market. Obviously, it's interesting, and I think it's too soon to say in a lot of ways. I think the point that I would make is that just because overall, it's a question of risk. And even though Somalia has normalized relations and these opportunities are available, it doesn't necessarily de-risk people's opportunity to be able to come in. And so the interesting question for me would be whether or not this intensifies competition for land amongst regional Somali diaspora actors who are in the area who might have more access easily now. But I don't view like foreign direct investment or those kinds of things becoming huge actors in the space, but don't hold me to that. The next point is the question of destroyed records. Mogadishu is very unique in the context where a lot of the records are not actually housed in Mogadishu at the moment. They're in private hands outside of the country and are basically in a parastatal kind of way being rented access to at the moment. And so one of the most important questions has been, how do we mediate access to records and archiving in this post-conflict moment? It has created a mess, really, because a lot of people don't have access to their titles and deeds. People don't tend to remember to take that with them when they're running from bullets, or people have died in exile in the diaspora, people were sharing houses, and it's created quite a few of contested overlapping claims, especially in the context where there is actually also a surfeit of record. So there's also parts of the large market in Mogadishu called Bukavu that specialize in the production of fake and false documents. So there's a creation also of a side business of validation and witnessing politics that all have to do with this really complicated kind of witnessing politics is what I think of it as. Finally, the question about memorialized history and moving on. I would argue that Mogadishu's reconstruction is demonstrative of the politics of not not looking or not memorializing in any way. You think about the ways that this kind of reconstruction is happening at pace with no significant conversation about the ways that the urban conflict has actually scarred the urban space. And so it's difficult even to point out in the context, because it's almost it's the silver lining, it's the good news story, it's the thing that makes everybody happy. But Mogadishu is like point and parcel the politics of moving on without engaging with specific politics that have brought you to the place of needing to move on in the first place. And so the question becomes, who is reconstruction for? And this is an open question that no one has really sought to answer. I think I'm going to answer the question about space and spatialized violence in the chat instead.
Thank you so much. And we have our last panelist.
Yeah, the last question.
Yeah. Yes, about the coalition between government and non-state actors. It happens in one level when it comes to the issue of stamp duty payment. The Lands Commission that represents government is supposed to actually go and do their assessed values. But there are some instances that they deliberately will know the values but might not act for their own gains. There's another level, which is not directly on value capture, but in terms of the general land administration. We had areas that government has compulsory acquired some years back, and now the state is more or less saying that it's no longer needed for public purpose and that giving it back to the original landowners. I see some elements of collusion here. In the end, when the lands are given back to the original landowners, you would find that some government functionaries would have allocation in these areas. So I think that's what I can say about the coalition of state and non-state actors in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting very interesting stuff indeed to all of the speakers. Finally, I would like to hand over to Liza to close the session with 5 minutes remarks on key points and the way forward. Welcome, Liza.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating and really fantastic responses from everyone. There's lots coming through in the chat in terms of why people think this work might be interesting. And I think it would be really nice at this moment to open up maybe just for 2, maybe maximum 3 people from the audience who may want to share or reflect on how this work might be useful for the context that they work with. Again, we have to keep these relatively tight as we're running over a bit, but we really wanted to understand from the perspective of people maybe who work on other cities, if any of these sort of sparked interesting thoughts while people kind of get themselves together. And Hannah, if you're able to unmute maximum 3 people. I think this question of land brokers has really struck people, and I see people in the chat coming through and saying that this is the same in other cities they've worked in. I also saw some comparisons with Nigeria coming through. And so I think we have struck, even though conflict cities might have some unique features, there are actually lots of interesting overlaps and shared concerns. We're really interested here in the implications for reform. So what would it mean for actually intervening in these very complex, very sometimes violent, incredibly contested sites where value is captured, created, dispersed, captured outside the country, speculated upon, and other processes. So do we have, Hannah, do we have a few hands that we could open up for reflections in the last couple of minutes? No hands yet. Okay, well, I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds, and if nobody has anything else they want to add, okay, fantastic.
I would like to give just my testimony about brokers in Bukavu, because it is an experience which is developed. And to answer to the question about the experience and initiative of regulation of this activity in Bukavu, brokers have created a union, like a syndicat in French. I don't know union in syndicat, and everybody is obliged to belong to the union, and it is not possible. It's prohibited for someone to to do this activity without known by the committee of this union. This is the first step to formalize this activity. The second experience initiative is that's now a first firm which is created as professional, and this firm has an office, and it has a WhatsApp group in which it diffuses information to other actors who are interesting to the activity. What is my contribution about initiative of formalization? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And it's kicked us off with a few other people who have also now wanted to add. Hannah, if we can just unmute, I think 2 people, Nicolas and Alphonse, we can get their inputs in our last rounds.
Yes, I'm Alphonse Jesse from Dar es Salaam, and very interesting presentations on especially on the issue of land value and of course brokers and all this. But I didn't hear anything about if there's anything ongoing, especially on land regularization, which I think is a very important aspect of capturing land value, and also and the issue of brokers, controlling the brokers. When we register, we bring in land tenure systems in the system, but I didn't hear anything about that. And I think that is very important, especially in our developing countries where informality is on the increase. I don't think it's being reduced, but informality is on the increase, but we need to do something on that, especially in the area of formalization and regularization. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for taking us in the direction of reform. Next person.
My name is Nick Tandy, and I work more in climate resilience. And I'm curious to get the collective wisdom and your thoughts, Lisa and the panelists, on the question of trying to institute climate resilient measures now, even though the reform towards formalization in some places may happen later. What do we do now to institute climate resilience, given an array of governance sort of mechanisms for land management and land decisions and so on? Thanks.
Thank you. So we've got 2 questions, one around climate resilience, and I think there's some interesting ties here with the sort of urban infrastructure questions that came up around flooding and drainage in the connectivity space, and also the question of land regularization, which I know for several of our scholars, they were exploring programs that had tried to more and less successful extents, both regularize kind of dysfunctional overlapping records, but also to regularize new areas that were sort of where informal settlement had taken place. If those are only 2 people that would like to speak, I'm going to hand over to Tom at this point to do some final reflections, unless anyone wants to actually directly respond to the questions that we got from the floor.
I can't see any hands up among our team, and we're conscious of wanting to try and keep things to time. So what I would say is, because those are both excellent questions, and there's a number of other excellent questions that we have in the chat, is that we will try to find a way to keep this conversation going. I think the expertise that we have in this room, which has been 100 or so participants, is incredible, and we really want to kind of continue this conversation in some way. So we will speak to the ACRC about how we might be able to do that. To be able to answer those questions more fully. We're really thankful for all of you for attending. We've had so many interesting comments and questions. Thanks so much to all of our presenters for showcasing just some of their fascinating work. Please do have a look at the report if you're interested to know more, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up with you in various ways. So thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, and thanks so much to Hannah for setting everything up for us and managing. Bye-bye.